I am Professor Gareth Miles, Head of School of Economics here at the University of Adelaide. On behalf of the University, I welcome you to the 2018 Jeff Harcourt Lecture. To start the proceedings, I wish to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite and Roseworthy are built. I also wish to acknowledge one of our attending Harcourt donors, Mr. Ian Kowalik, AM. The donors have given generously to support the professorship and we wish to offer them our thanks. Other notable guests who are attending this event include Mr. Brad Guy, Executive Director, Department, Premier and Cabinet, Mr. Darryl Gobbert, Chief Economist, Balliol Host, Mr. Ron Langman, CEO, Langman Corporation, Mr. Con McCarlis, Head of Investments, statewide, Mr. Glenn Weir, Professor Peter Raftian, Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Suzanne Lemire, Acting Dean, Faculty of Professions, and Inga Davis, Chief Executive, External Relations. I would also like to thank our very special guests, Professor Jeff Harcourt and Mrs. Joan Harcourt. The proceedings for this evening will commence with Professor Richard Pomfret, introducing Professor John Siegfried, who will deliver the 2018 Jeff Harcourt Lecture. After the lecture is concluded, Professor Siegfried will take a few questions from the floor before the event is concluded. I now invite Professor Richard Pomfret of the Institute for International Trade to come forward and introduce our 2018 lecturer. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Gareth, and welcome everybody. Welcome, Julio. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the presence that we actually have Jeff and Joan Harcourt here. Jeff Harcourt is known to many of you. He has very long association with the University of Adelaide before departing to less green grass, I think, in Cambridge. But obviously, as a mark of his heritage, is that several alumni got together to create the Harcourt Professorship and the Harcourt Lecture Series. And I think it's a very worthy tribute to Jeff's role in the university, creating more or less a modern economics department here. My duty is to welcome very briefly, I hope, John Siegfried, who's also had a long association with the University of Adelaide. Purportedly, it started when John was so annoyed with his colleagues in his department in the United States, a syndrome we can many times relate to, took his wife's knitting needle, stuck it through the globe from Nashville, where Vanderbilt University is, and found that Adelaide was as far as he could possibly go to get away from Nashville. Since then, and that was 1986, here we are, 52 years later, he's still here, something about a bad penny, I don't know. Anyway, John's played a great role for economics at Adelaide. He's not only taught a variety of courses. I shared with him teaching a course in economics of sports for 5 years, I think it was, to third-year students. He's also played a major role in mentoring honours students. He always had time to read honours dissertations, which I think many of us will admit is a really not a simple burden. He has also helped the school with its hiring, particularly in hiring people in North America, where he had a huge fund of contacts. And in general, I think contributing to the smooth running and academic excellence of the department. Just to give a brief biographical background, John's a farm boy, really. He might not look it today, but his career started in Wisconsin, where he did his PhD in 1972 in industrial economics. He then published a raft of publications in, if you think of the top journals in economics, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Journal of Economic Literature, the Review of Economics and Statistics. He published not just one in those, but several in each of those. So, he's really a stellar publication record, but he also was always concerned about the real world. He worked with the American Council of Economic Advisors in the mid-1970s and at the Federal Trade Commission. He's also been a regular witness in antitrust cases, basically trying to nail the big bad firms, right? Hopefully when they're doing something wrong, rather than just lining his pockets. He has also given back to the profession. I mean, he is the most published person ever in the American Economic Review because for a long time, I think, was it about 16 years, you were the secretary of the American Economic Association, which meant he read a report every year. He said, what has the association done? But on the other hand, secretary wasn't just writing reports. It was more like Stalin, I think, than the typical secretary. So he also knew all of the presidents of the American Economics Association, which is a very august body. You know, so these are several Nobel Prize winners. And a few years ago, he had the idea of asking these famous economists, what has economics ever done for us? You know, what can economics do to promote better living? And out of that came, I think, a fairly influential book. I mean, to economists, it should be obvious. You know, economists are the good guys. But for a lot of people, they don't accept that, surprisingly. They think that economists live in an ivory tower. You know, they never get in touch with the real world. They think if you have 4 economists in a room, you get 4 different opinions. Unless you're Jeff Harcourt saying if one of them was John Maynard Keynes, you get 5 different opinions, as I've heard him say. And yet, when we look at the outcomes, there's a lot of things that economists agree on. We can see their opinions on international trade today. The agreement among economists is much, much wider than one might expect from the few people who get media time. What I then want to hand over to John is to ask him to tell us, you know, what has economics done to make our lives better? John, the floor.
Thank you, Richard. The story about the knitting needle was apocryphal. You can't stick a knitting needle through a globe. Instead, I put my fingers on both sides. And that was true, and I still have the globe. Also, in response to Richard, I did grow up on a farm, potato farm, but probably more surprisingly, I'm one of the few professors, I believe, that had an earlier career driving a big rig, an 18-wheeler, not an 82-wheeler. I saw an 82-wheeler in the Northern Territory here, 5 trailers, but I had to drive mine through New York City and out the other end, out to Long Island. That was about the time when I started wondering if there were other possible occupations. And I found one, and I'm very happy with it. This is a picture of the cover of the book that Richard was talking about, and I thought I would mention, well, 2 things here. The title, usually I have a little quiz with the audience about where did better living through economics come from. Quickly, anybody have an idea? It's better living through something else. You have to be my age or older. It was chemistry. That was DuPont's television advertising slogan for about 15 years in the 1950s and 60s. But when the book was done, as is usually the case, the editor or the author gets a copy of what is the proposed cover, and what you see up there came to me, and first thing I did was look at it and said, "What's this?" Well, look at it. What is it? There's a connection here to Australia, actually. Up the top, those, I guess, are rubber chickens, but the whole idea was they are chickens, and what are they falling into? A pot. Not the kind you smoke, but the kind you cook in. So, chicken in every pot. Where did that come from? That was an American presidential campaign slogan, like, "Make America Great Again." Have you heard that here? Yeah. Only this one was a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. And what president? That president spent time in Australia, 2 years. Herbert Hoover, who was a mining engineer, and when he was 23 years old, he popped up in Kalgoorlie and was a mine manager, and he actually, I just was looking this up today, he designed the first mine shaft that didn't go straight down. It went down on a 30-degree angle. And then in 1928, he ran for U.S. president and won with using this slogan, a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. He ran for re-election in 1932. How'd that work out? Well, the other party, of course, the Democrats, kept reminding everyone that he had promised a chicken in every pot, and of course in the intervening period was October 1929. And back in those days, apparently what a president said was supposed to mean something and stuck with you. So being inconsistent a few years later did really matter, and he did not win in 1932. This is just a statement of why I did the book. I started a long time ago with a yellow tablet writing down things that had happened that I thought economists had a big role in accomplishing, both in providing economic theory, providing empirical evidence, and in most of these cases, the economists were also actually involved in the political implementation. One of the neat things about being an economist, as opposed to most other social scientists, and they sure have envy about this, is that we're all over the place in the government. You know, there are thousands of economists working for the U.S. government, from the Federal Reserve to the 2 competition policy boards, to the Department of Labor, to the Department of Commerce. We're everywhere, and including the Council of Economic Advisors. One of these came from Professor Rebecca Blank, now president of the University of Wisconsin. Well, she had the same kind of job I did at the Council of Economic Advisors, only she's a lot younger than I am. Here are the 12 chapters, and you'll notice I didn't write any of them. One of my daughters proofread the book, and at the end I got a call from her, and she said, "Dad, what a great book!" She owns an art gallery in Charleston, South Carolina, and has a degree in art history, so this, you might suspect, created a little surprise to me of, gee, did you actually read the content of this thing? She said, "Oh, no, I just looked for typos," but the great part is you had to only write a 5-page introduction and you got your name on the cover. Artists. Here are the 12 that I got to write about, and there were about 3 or 4 of these that I thought I could have written, and my plan was to ask the best person I could think of to write these chapters, and then I'd see which ones turned me down, and then I'd be the plan B on those. Well, nobody turned me down. I got every one of them that I wanted. Shocking, actually. Here's a list of 7 additional chapters that I never got to because the plan was, if I couldn't find anybody to write some of the first list of 12, I might go to some of these other ones. And while I could talk about each one of these for 20 minutes and we'd be here till 9 o'clock, I'm going to just skip right on and into the meat of it, because what I wanted to do today is I picked 4 of them out of the 12. And I'll start to talk about each one and how this happened. These are stories. You're not going to learn anything about economic theory here today. Maybe a little bit about the history of economic thought, but that would be at best. So I picked 4 of them, and the first one is emissions permit trading, because I know the term cap and trade has been heard here as well. And indeed, I've heard it on television. About 6 years ago, you had an emissions tax passed, and then it disappeared in 3 years ago or something. Do I have my timing about right? But here, as in the United States, you normally hear it called cap and trade. But economists don't say it that way. We say cap and trade. The emphasis is on the trading part from economists. The fact that pollution causes costs that producers don't necessarily internalize and appreciate and take into account in their pricing has been recognized for over 100 years. A.C. Pigou, probably 110 years ago, was, I think, the first to point this out, and even to point out the solution to this problem, which is to add some cost, maybe artificially, by government, by a tax, to the producer's cost, so that the cost that the producer confronts is the total real cost of producing the product. And the cost you want to add on, the tax you want to add on, would be the marginal pollution cost. That's not really the question that the cap and trade issue addresses. The cap and trade issue addresses the second question, which is down below on the slide, which is which pollution to cut back if we want to cut back some pollution. So this story actually begins with that left-wing pico-commie rat President Richard Nixon, who was the start of the Environmental Protection Agency. He did a lot of things that surprised people. He's behind our Occupational Health and Safety Administration. He was the first U.S. president to go to China. He did a lot of things that you would never expect a Republican president to do, and indeed was not all that different from his successor, Gerald Ford, who was the president when I was in the old executive office building at the Council of Economic Advisors. Whenever people ask me what political party I'm a member of, I say, oh, well, I served in the Ford administration. And then I often go, oh, you're a Democrat. No, he was a Republican. He was the Republican head of our Congress. Oh, yeah, but today he'd be a Democrat. And that's probably true, and so would Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, really a surprise. Well, our Environmental Protection Act was passed in 1970. It was done the way Donald Trump does things. It was an executive order. And then later, Congress said, oh, we like this, so they passed legislation that was consistent with the executive order. But it started out right away just with Nixon deciding that this was something that he thought was important and he wanted to do. Where are we here? Okay, and so to begin with, we had what's called a command and control system. In the early 1970s, there were a lot of environmental disasters in the United States. You might have read about the river in Cleveland, Ohio, the Cuyahoga, that caught on fire. A river, yes, the surface of the river was burning and they couldn't put the fire out. Cleveland and Pittsburgh are longtime steel-producing cities. Were very hard to drive through because you couldn't see anything. It looked like a fog. It was actually smog. It was pollution from all the steel plants. And the Environmental Protection Act provided a basis for reducing a lot of this pollution. And right away, what the EPA did, Environmental Protection Agency did, was to order reductions in emissions at particular points. They also had certain emissions limits for areas. And let me just use an example in Pittsburgh, where, which is in western Pennsylvania, where they had a lot of emissions restrictions. And this was a period of economic growth. New firms would come in, but they couldn't start operating because they didn't have any permission to pollute anymore because the existing firms had already hit the ceiling. So how do you manage with a situation like this? Well, good old American ingenuity. Some of the new firms went and bought some of the old firms. The old firms were in different industries. Let's exaggerate and say buggy whips or something like this. And if they had some pollution allowances, the new firm bought them, and they were, Microsoft with buggy whips or something like this. And they had no intention of producing buggy whips. They got rid of the buggy whips. They wanted the pollution permits that they had. And so this helped improve the economy, helped us move along, except it was pretty awkward to be buying firms just to get their pollution permits. And moreover, it's not clear that this would actually be the efficient way to do it. What you really want to have happen is you want to have it's usually the new production facilities lower their pollution, because it's cheaper and easier to do it, and often you can do it with building the pollution reduction in at the beginning, at the get-go, when you're building the plant. And it's usually the old plants that are be very hard to rejigger in order to lower the pollution that you would then allow to continue to pollute. So the question would be, how do you do this while the command and control people could figure out who's a high-cost polluter and who's a low-cost polluter. I should have said low-cost polluter avoider is what I really want. And then they pick the ones that are low-cost pollution avoiders and say, you have to spend the money to avoid the pollution, and we'll let the other guys continue to pollute. Although this presumes an expertise of the command and control people that's probably just in people's imagination rather than in reality. So what really started this cap and trade thing was Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991. Really, for 2 articles, he has one of the shortest CVs of any Nobel Prize winner, probably surely has the shortest CV of any Nobel Prize winner. He had 2 really important articles. One was about why we have firms, and why is the whole economy one firm. That I'll set aside. And then about 25 years later, 1960, he wrote an article called The Problem of Social Cost, which is the original article that talks about property rights and buying and selling property rights. And the Coase theorem, which every undergraduate student should know when they graduate, and the Coase article, which at one point was the most highly cited article in all of economics. I don't know if that's still true today, but in the 1980s it was. His theory was actually quite simple, and that is you can assign the property rights to anybody you want to. We could allow the non-smokers to have the right to clean air in this room, or we could have the smokers have the right to smoke if you want. As long as you can identify the owners of the property rights and at low cost let people buy and sell them, whether we have smoke-free air in the room or smoky air in the room, will end up the same result each time, and it will go to the parties that value it the most. If the first assignment happens to be to the parties that value it the most, it'll just stay there. There'll be no transaction. If on the other hand, it goes to the party that does not value it the most, then there will be a trade. This works very well when you have 2 people, say, living together in a flat, and they know who to negotiate with and so on. It works harder in this whole room because I suspect I'm not the only non-smoker who does not like smoke in the room, but maybe the rest of you non-smokers could get together and pay off the smokers, and then I wouldn't have to contribute. I could, what we call, free ride. And that's a problem, and that's a transactions cost problem that can cause this to fail. Baumol and Oates, not too long after that, showed that a tax, a carbon tax here, was what I'm talking about, could also achieve the same result, because if you started at a very low tax and started raising it, as you raise the tax on carbon emissions, the firms that would stop emitting the carbon are the ones for which it is cheaper to eliminate the emissions. And those are the ones you want to eliminate the emissions. Those for which it's very difficult to stop emitting the pollution would keep on polluting, and at some point you get to the amount of emissions that you want. The cap and trade thing is not about whether or not we are going to have emissions abatement. That is a separate decision. It's a difficult decision, but it's a separate decision. It's only about who is going to stop doing the emitting. And the tax is one way to do it. It's probably not the best way, because with the sale of permits, if you have a number of permits that are equal to the amount of pollution that you think the natural environment can assimilate, okay, and only those who have the permits can emit the pollution, then when everybody has bought and sold those permits, it will be the parties that need the permit, because it is very difficult for them to avoid the pollution, that will have it. And each of the parties knows how much it will cost them to eliminate the pollution. That is the key here. It is getting the decisions back to the people who have the information. the real key here in moving forward with cap and trade was a lot of empirical cost effectiveness studies done by economists during the 1960s and 70s that showed that cap and trade could reduce costs much more than the administrative decision of who can pollute. A big breakthrough was in 1976 when the Environmental Protection Agency recognized that some firms were buying other firms in order to get their pollution rights. They said, why have this big complication of having these strange firms like a computer software company combined with a buggy whip company? This is just stupid. So they started a plan where firms, new entrants or any firm could buy the pollution permits directly from the other firm. They actually put a little kicker on there. You had to buy 120% of what you needed, and then the 20% was retired. This made it quite popular among environmentalists because this was reducing the total amount of pollution that was going on. It really wasn't a big cost because of the cost savings that were going on by getting the pollution reduction to the firms that could do it the best. The success story started in 1990. I know it says 1980 there, but that's not really an 8, that's a 9. It started in 1990 with sulfur dioxide and the EPA starting a market for permits. The way they distributed the permits could be questioned. They gave them to firms, they gave them out free to firms in proportion to the amount of emissions they had been emitting. Well, this had the problem that if you knew this was coming, you'd be shoveling the coal on and emitting everything you could ahead of time. But there were a lot of political compromises to try to get this done. Since 1990, they have been traded, actually it was 95 when they started being traded on the Chicago Board of Trade. That means you no longer have to drive around Pittsburgh to see who else has, who's polluting and may have a pollution permit or something. You just go to your representative on the Chicago Board of Trade and, if it's open, no, it's not open now, but it'll be open in a few hours. We could buy some tomorrow morning if we wanted them. And transaction would all be done electronically today. So let me move on to another one, airline deregulation. This one's a lot of fun because this was sort of a hobby of mine. I actually never wrote anything about airline deregulation that was published, but when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, this is what we were working on. Airline deregulation, natural gas pipeline deregulation, trucking deregulation, and all kinds of deregulation. And the kind of philosophy behind it was that regulations make sense when there's a market failure. And so the idea was the economists were assigned to find the market failure. What is the market failure? Well, why are we doing this? Well, here at the bottom of that slide, I give you the two arguments that were made for airlines. Airlines were originally regulated in the U.S. in 1938. We had two regulatory authorities for airlines, the CAA, Civil Aeronautics, CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board, and another one called the FAA, that's the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA is the one that says you can't take explosives onto a plane, the plane shouldn't have blowout patches on the tires, and they should have enough fuel on to get across the ocean and things like that. That is still there, and it's all there. We didn't make any changes with respect to safety. The Civil Aeronautics Board is one of the few regulatory agencies that I've ever come across that completely disappeared. Completely disappeared. There's nothing left of it. So what were the arguments? One was it's an infant industry, and in the 1930s, airlines were struggling and they were worried about predatory pricing by railroads. If you've ever been to America and ridden on the railroads, you know what a joke this would be. We have the worst rail system that it could possibly be designed. But in any case, by the 1970s, the industry was 40 years old, and while some of us who came of age about 18 when we went into the Army in the Korean War or the Vietnam War would think you're an adult when you're 18, but nowadays, based on my 4 kids, you're still a kid till you're about 30. My youngest just made it, and what a relief it is. So the infant industry argument is come on, how long can you be an infant industry, for heaven's sakes? The more serious argument was scale economies, and this kind of makes sense. Take a big 747 jumbo jet, or the A380, which now flies from Sydney to Dallas, shortens my trip by a few hours, very nice. And think about scale economies. If you have 1 passenger on the plane, the passenger has to pay for the whole plane, and the fuel and everything. 2, you can split it in half. So if we have an average cost curve, which I'm going to start up here on your left and go to the right as we add passengers, first it goes to 1/2, then you put a 3rd passenger on, now we're down to 1/3 of the original, the 4th one we're down to 1/4, and we have this declining average cost curve. Makes perfect sense. There's a big fixed capital component here, we all know that. But that's not the issue. What airline has 1 airplane? The issue is the airline system, the whole set of them. And once you add the 2nd plane, the first one, the average cost curve goes down. Add a 2nd plane, whoop, we're right back up to where we were for the original one. And then it goes down again, back up, down again, and actually you get what looks like waves in the ocean. And indeed, Dick Caves, who wrote a book in 1962, the whole book looking at this issue. Is that readable at the back? Yeah. Was the first one to demonstrate that there really are no scale economies for airlines as opposed to airplanes. And poof, there went the arguments about the reasons for airline regulation. There was other economic research that helped. Michael Levine and William Jordan both wrote a book about 2 different airlines, PSA in California and Southwest in Texas, that were inside of state borders. The U.S. Constitution allows federal regulation of T-E-R, interstate commerce, not T-R-A, state competition. And so if you stayed inside one state, you were okay. And these were unregulated carriers. And what they found, and I have it on, I think, the next slide, yeah, see the little pictures here? These are 2 airline routes flown by the same types of airplanes that are about the same distance, or a little different, but $18 is a lot less than 41. These are back in 1970 dollars. You can't go from San Francisco to LA for $18 anymore, but I used current dollars back then. But the mileage is almost the same, and you can see the difference. Their books demonstrated that. So how could these other airlines provide service so much cheaper? It was because they provided lower quality service, and that's better, much better. Because the 3rd book up there by Douglas and Miller, my nomination for the best book on regulation of all time, because it had a great theoretical model that was published in the American Economic Review, and then had the empirical evidence to back it up. And their argument was that the economic regulation was creating too much quality for too high a price. If you offered people half the quality for a quarter of the price, notice I went down further on the price than I did on the quality, they would say, great. So what was quality? Well, quality in those days was the load factor. Whether you got an empty seat next to you, whether you had to sit in the middle seat. Okay. And I can remember in the early 70s, indeed in 1976, when I was working at the Council of Economic Advisors, my wife stayed in Nashville, which is about 700 miles from Washington. And along with our congressmen and senators, on Friday night, I would take the plane back to Nashville, and Monday morning back to Washington. Nowadays, the senators go on Tuesday and come back on Thursday. Work week, as gotten shortened over the time. But I can remember being on one of the planes with one of our senators. I remember it because it came to a screeching halt at the end of the runway, and the pilot stopped, and it was silence. Everybody's looking at each other. And Senator Sasser was across the aisle from me. And then the pilot says, that didn't work. And the rest of us saying, no shit. Let's try it again. And I remember one of the people on the plane, there were about a dozen people on the plane, and that's my point. There were a lot of empty seats. Somebody said, could we go back to the terminal and have somebody bang on the side of the plane with a hammer so we at least think you tried to fix it? We all thought he left the parking brake on, which is not a good way to have the airplane take off. So Douglas and Miller demonstrate that this regulation, which does not allow new firms into the industry or any routes, but does allow the existing ones to fly as many flights as they want, and fixes the prices. There were two carriers on this route, one is deceased, Braniff, and the other American. They get together, propose a price, and the CAB says, okay, that'll be the price. And anybody that prices below that is breaking the federal law. So you can't price below that. But, so how do you compete? Now you raise the price, and now you really want to get customers. So what you do is if you have flights at 9, 11, 1, and 3 going one direction, you add another one at 10, 12, 2, and 4, because I might want to go at 2:30 or something, or 2:15, closer to 2 o'clock. And so this will attract me away from the other one. Well, by putting the extra flights on, you may induce a few more passengers to join on this route, but not many, so you're just diluting the passengers over more flights. And when you dilute them over more flights, yes, I always had seats on both sides of me with no kids spilling orange juice on me or something like that. But indeed, then what happens is the airlines have to pay for the extra flights. They have to pay the pilots, the flight attendants, and they say, we're not making much money. So they get together with the other airline, they say, let's propose a rate increase, and they go to the CAB and they get a rate increase. And what happens? We go through the same thing again until all of a sudden, in those days, there were probably, I'm guessing, a dozen flights a day from Nashville, where I lived, to Washington, and each of the planes probably had 130 passengers, so you have well over 1,000 seats. Today, there's about 6 of the smaller planes, and so we have maybe 500 seats at best. And has the population of either of the places gone down? No, it hasn't gone down, but the planes are all packed. Well, what was happening earlier was there were 11 or 1,200 seats. 11 or 1,200 seats, and but only half of them were filled. So how did this happen? Stephen Breyer, who is now one of our Supreme Court justices, was an assistant professor at Harvard. He organized here, and he worked for Ted Kennedy. He went to Washington to work a couple of years for Ted Kennedy, a well-known, very left-leaning Democrat, who didn't like the idea of paying the $41.67 to go home to Boston to get to Hyannisport to the Kennedy compound, when he knew that some friends of his in California were only paying $19 for about the same route. And so this looked like it was a Democratic policy, but the Ford administration chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Greenspan, he got on board for deregulation. Well, now we have a recipe for success. We have Democrats and Republicans in favor of this. And indeed, the other sentence there explains the Douglas and Miller theory, so I will not repeat it. What happened after that was Jimmy Carter appointed a charismatic economist. Many of you will think that's an oxymoron. But Fred Kahn really was a charismatic economist. He could sell a used car to anybody. Indeed, he is the economist who was told by Jimmy Carter to not ever use the word recession. So he then said, I'm going to use it one more time. Hereafter, people, whenever I say banana, you think recession. And there are some really hilarious speeches that he gave that have a lot of bananas in them. Kahn added Elizabeth Bailey, who wrote the chapter in the book, as a commissioner. They had economists on the staff. And so now they had infiltrated the Civil Aeronautics Board as a regulatory body. And now they got economists in there. And to try to cut out some of the details, the way they got this accomplished, there's a lot of resistance to airline deregulation because, after all, one of the results was too many flights. Twice as many flights as you really should have. So if we cut back to what we should have, some people would lose their jobs. Pilots, flight attendants, anybody that works on a basis of a flight. So lots of political opposition. And flight attendants and pilots are very powerful unions because if you don't do what they want to do, they say, well, how would you like to drive everywhere? We're just going to shut down the industry. We'll go on strike. You can't fly without flight attendants because they open the doors in emergencies. So either the flight attendants or the pilots can shut it down. And they are very effective. So the way that they finagled around this was they first deregulated cargo. There were 4 big cargo companies. FedEx is the only one who survives, whose name you would recognize for 40 years later. And because there were no flight attendants on the cargo is just going to sink, I guess, if the plane goes down in the Great Lakes because no one would be there to open the door to let the cargo out. And so you didn't have to worry about flight attendants. And you also didn't have to worry, a worry were a lot of potential passengers in very rural places in America, particularly those big rectangular states that have no people but 2 senators. And those states, the people in Laramie, Wyoming, said, we want to still have air service, even though it makes no sense to have air service to Laramie, Wyoming. Well, cargo, you didn't have a problem with that. So once they deregulated cargo in 1977, what happened was the stock prices of cargo airlines skyrocketed. Shortly thereafter, Delta Airlines, a passenger airline, still around, there aren't too many of them from those days that are still around, Delta Airlines chief executive says, this deregulation stuff might be very good for my stock options, meaning I might be able to get the same gain. So Delta was the first one that flipped and stopped opposing so much. What the CAB did in 1977 was it allowed entry, interstate entry, it was from Southwest Airlines, which is now, I believe, the largest carrier in the United States. Actually, I know it's the largest valued airline by 50% higher than United or American. In the U.S., into airports at Newark, Baltimore. Midway is an airport in South Chicago, San Jose, a lot of places where today Southwest is the dominant airline, and these airports were sitting there kind of empty. These were airports from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and they had been replaced by the new airports such as O'Hare in Chicago, replacing Midway, and so on, that were built in the 1960s. So they were kind of vacant. And the idea was, well, let's let the Southwest Airlines fly in there. Of course, the legacy airlines said, well, nobody wants to go there. That's why we don't have any flights into there. They want to go to O'Hare, not to Midway. Wrong. All the people in the south side of Chicago would rather only drive 10 miles to an airport instead of 30 miles to an airport. And so and then they allowed discounted fares for, the idea was for 35% of your capacity. The capacity, the airplanes were full about 55%. So 35% was even less than all the empty seats. So the idea was, you can discount to fill up those empty seats. And passenger air service was deregulated by the CAB in October 1978. It was phased out over about 2 to 4 years, and the whole place disappeared in 1985. Studies since then, immediately fares seem to be 50% lower. Some more sophisticated studies since then say they're about 30% lower than what the fares probably would have been. The estimated welfare gain I have there by Nancy Rose at MIT is now about 12 to 15 years old, and that's $28 billion of approximately $2005. So it's a lot larger than that, and it's that per year. A more recent study has found something interesting. If Southwest Airlines is not serving your route, so Washington to Nashville, Southwest does not serve that route, but Southwest does serve Nashville going to other places, and it does serve Washington, or Baltimore, which is close to Washington, going to other places. Any route where Southwest is hovering, the airfares are a lot lower, like 40% lower, because Southwest does not have to build facilities in Nashville. They have facilities in Nashville, and one of the wonderful things about an airline industry is you can, as one economist once said, you can fly your marginal costs around to different locations. So I have, what, about 5 minutes left or less? I'm just going to skip that one and go right to my favorite and talk a little bit about the Army. You probably are aware that the United States, well, you had conscription too, didn't you? But we had conscription from World War II up through the late up through, you're going to find out, in 1971. And it was the Vietnam War that led, I think, to the interest in conscription and its inefficiencies. Milton Friedman, in a 1962 book called Capitalism and Freedom, which is one of the two book readers I had in my undergraduate first-year economics course in 1963. The other one was a book by John Kenneth Galbraith. There is not a word of agreement in those two books. But you'll see that's kind of interesting because at one point, Friedman and Galbraith both endorsed going to an all-volunteer army. If you can get those two people who can't agree that it's even daylight out to agree on something, again, you might have something that's going to happen politically. Two big problems with an all-volunteer, with a conscription. One illustrated by my master's supervisor who was in the Army, related a story about peeling potatoes one day with 5 other guys, and he asked them what kind of education they had, and on average they had a little more than a master's degree. Some of them had law degrees and so on, but they all had advanced degrees, and they were experts in peeling potatoes. This was about 10 years after McDonald's invented the automatic potato peeling machine, but the Army was still using individuals to peel potatoes because they were paid at the time 50 cents an hour. That was low. You know, the American minimum wage is very low. Today it's still $7 an hour, but that 50 cents was half of the American minimum wage at the time. So it was very cheap. And if it's very cheap, why buy a machine? The machine didn't have a discount rate. It didn't have a lower cost. So the Army was using the wrong factor proportions. Too much labor, not enough equipment, because the price of labor was distorted, because Uncle Sam there was saying, you serve in the Army and we're going to decide how much to pay you. The other problem was a conscripted Army had a lot of people in it who are much more valuable in the civilian economy than they are in the military economy. And so the opportunity cost of the soldiers was much higher than it had to be. There's also a fairness issue, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just slough over that. The guy who was unlucky to get drafted bore all the cost, and the guy who was not, that was me. I just lucked out and not got drafted, so I didn't pay the cost. A volunteer Army has to be paid more. How do you get the money? You tax me. So there's more of a fairness issue here. The people that didn't serve had to pay the taxes, and the people that did serve got a higher salary, so they didn't feel as bad about being in the military. There was also people, I had a friend eating on an ice cream diet to get diabetes so he would be exempted. I didn't know of such people, but there were people that shot themselves in the foot. What you wanted to have was a medical problem that didn't really ruin your life. although some of those sound like they might ruin your life, so you could stay out. And that was a big cost. And a lot of people moved to Canada. And who wouldn't have otherwise moved to Canada, and Richard wants to know what's wrong with moving to a better place. Well, yeah, I agree. In the 60s, Hansen and Weisbrod, they were two of the people on my thesis committee, and a group of Virginia PhD students. This was kind of remarkable. Jim Miller put together this group of graduate students. He was a graduate student there. It turned out they had about 8 chapters in this book, and everyone wrote a chapter. 6 or 7 of them became well-known economists. I could never have picked those people out when I was a graduate student from among my colleagues. The only thing I knew about them was who were good ball players and who were not. Jim Miller later became the head of the Federal Trade Commission. He was our director of the Office of Management and Budget, the budget director. He had 1 or 2 other regulatory jobs, and his last one was the head of the Postal Commission. If there's ever an impossible job, that was it. He had all kinds of regulatory responsibilities. Well, he got these people together and they wrote this book, and Friedman and Galbraith endorsed this book that the graduate students had written. Now, how did it all work? I'm going to end with this. I won't have time for the 4th one. Martin Anderson was a young economist at Columbia University, and one day a friend of his came to New York, and so they went out to lunch, but they didn't take a paper napkin with them, so they couldn't write a Laffer curve or something like that. So this all happened verbally. And Martin was describing to his friend, who turned out was working for the Nixon election campaign, the research that was pointing out the opportunity cost problem and the factor proportions problem that was caused by conscription. His friend went back to the campaign headquarters and apparently, not verified, but apparently he actually talked to Nixon directly without having any other staff and campaign managers involved and told Nixon about this. A week later on television, Nixon in a speech says, "And now I have something special for all of you young men that would prefer not to get shot at in Vietnam. I'm not going to make you go. So if I'm president, you won't have to go because there's not going to be a draft anymore. The day to vote is on November 6th. And I've been here when I hear your politicians promising a rail spur line to some local community or something, which I say, why don't they just give them cash? Because maybe that's more valuable. But this was one of the all-time bribes. It wasn't in cash, but a lot of people would value not getting shot at much more than cash. And so he was elected. This was only 3 weeks before the election, so just about where we are right now in the current election cycle in the United States. And once he was elected, Nixon did what all presidents do when they want to change something. They appoint a commission. It was chock full of economists. Friedman was on it. Alan Greenspan was on it. Walter Roy, an important person on it. Robert Barrow, who's now a macroeconomist. In his first few years of his career, he was a Defense Department economist. So it was chock full of them. A year or 2 years, I guess, later, the commission recommended abolishing the draft. Nixon sent the bill to Congress, and it fell flat on its face. The House Armed Service Committee said, nope, we're not going to do this because you got to pay the soldiers more to get them to volunteer. And if you think we're voting for taxes to cover those higher salaries, you're crazy. Our constituents will vote us out. Tried it again, didn't work. Tried it again, didn't work. Then they had Walter Roy, and his picture is up there. He appears to be squinting. He was blind for his whole life. He had the most remarkable memory. I met him maybe 8 or 10 times, and he could tell me exactly what we talked about every one of the prior times. I could never come across something like this. And it's such a shame that he lived during a period when the technology didn't facilitate blindness the way it does today. His life would have been so much easier today. He testified before the Armed Service Committee, and he came up with a new argument. It was on one of the earlier slides. He pointed out that people who are drafted, as soon as their 2-year term is up, that's the standard draft term, they're out of there. In fact, the day that they go in the Army, they get a big calendar with 365 times 2 days, cross them off as you go along. But people who volunteer tend to serve not 2 years, but 4.5. After all, they volunteered. They may even like this. Maybe they're acquiring a skill that they can use. Not all of them are jet fighter pilots, which doesn't have a very much of a market in the domestic economy. But many of them can learn skills that they can use in the domestic economy. And the key was he estimated that the total cost of payroll to the entire U.S. Army, I don't know if it was the whole military or just the Army, would be 6% less if you had a volunteer Army. Because of the re-enlistments, you don't have to have the training of the new people. And he worked it out 6%. There were enough people on the Armed Service Committee, that enough congressmen said, oh, so if the extra costs were 6% less, well, that's just enough to get my vote. And it passed the Armed Services Committee. That was the hang-up when it went to the full House of Representatives. It passed. And for some reason, a reason I just cannot figure out, I've looked for it, it was never in doubt in the Senate. And so it zoomed through our Senate. And as you can see at the bottom there, it passed in September 1971. And the volunteer military, began in 1973. I was born in 1945 on the day the flag went up on Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, which I discovered only in my 40s when I was sitting in a restaurant next to a big picture of it and had my birth date on the bottom of it. And so I would have been 26 years old in 1971. In the U.S., you are eligible for the draft between ages 18 and 26. So I spent the full 8 years going home every night, opening the mailbox, looking to see if there was a nice friendly letter from Local Board 29 in Hamburg, Pennsylvania. Yes, I do remember even the number of the board, as most people do from that era. But because I did a bunch of teaching during that period, which was a legitimate deferment, both Donald Trump and I escaped going into the Army during the same time period. So I'll end there. I had one more that I might have done, but there's 12 of them, and there's no difference really between talking about 3 or 4 of them. Vinay.
So thank you very much, John. We have time for some questions from the floor, if people would like to raise any questions. Go ahead, Florian.
So you brought examples where economists got their way. What would be the biggest one today where you would say that like economists have some good idea, but they can't get it done? But they can't get it implemented.
There's an easy one in the United States right now, free trade. I mean, pretty obvious. We have a president who doesn't listen unless he's right about the big bluff. And it worked with Canada. I have a feeling it may not work with China. There's a pretty autocratic, headstrong person there that I think is ready to play hardball with the bluff. They probably also say don't have a big tax cut when you're close to full employment. That's exactly the opposite of what I remember teaching in introductory economics. It's supposed to be when you have a lot of unemployment during a recession, you're supposed to have a big tax cut. However, these decisions are not economic decisions. One of the nice things about the working in the Ford administration was I did not feel any partisan pressures at all. It just seemed like everybody was just working to work through, is there a market failure and what's the right thing to do? And even there was some, as I pointed out there with the military draft at the end about the cost, there's politics were involved, but not in a way that they're involved in every darn decision today.
Thank you. Any further questions? Go ahead, Julia.
Well, first of all, thank you all. This was intellectually fascinating and really entertaining. So I would like to ask the reverse question that Florian just asked. These are all success stories. Can you mention a couple examples of where we got it badly wrong?
Well, I don't have a really good one. I thought you were going to propose one, the one that is always proposed. I get that question every time I've presented this. And that would be the failures to predict the financial crisis, which I reject as a failure.
Me too.
Because My analysis of the global financial crisis, the GFC here, incidentally, no one else in the world calls it the GFC. I have no idea why that is. I think that was caused by downright criminal fraud. And a lot of fraud in a number of different ways, with the mortgages and these tranches of things they were selling off with misleading advertising and lots of stuff like that. I don't think there are a lot of them, but I think Florian's question was kind of more to the point, because if you have a bad idea, the way this works, you got to get approval at a whole bunch of stages, and it's very easy for them to say no. I remember when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, I had just written a paper about National Football League broadcast blackouts. I don't know if you ever heard of that here, or does the AFL have the same thing here? So if the local team does not sell out the stadium, they can't broadcast the game locally. And I don't want to get into the details of it, but I had done an extensive analysis of it. And the legislation expired, and here I am working in the White House complex, and I thought, hey, I can have some influence here. So I wrote up the paper we wrote about, it's 40 pages. I got it down to 10, and I sent it over to the legislative coordinator. I had called ahead, can I do this? Yes. And they had said, yes, send a one-page summary. So I sent 10 pages, and they kind of wrote back probably with some smart aleck comment that didn't they teach you to count in Wisconsin or something. So I got it down to about 3 pages, and I sent it over again. Came back again and said 1 page. Well, and then I got it to them, and it went through the hoops. But I had to get all these different levels of approval there. And if our idea was a terrible one, I don't think it was a terrible one. We had evidence that the blackout law didn't really work, and good evidence that it did. That some games that, well, I don't want to get into details of it. In any case, the whole point was to get it to Congress, you had to go through all these hoops, and if it's a bad idea, it just got shot down somewhere. So there probably are some. Yeah, one time I had a little list of 2 or 3 of them, but moreover, I was here to, my goal is to promote the value of economics. The value, in these chapters, there are, in many of them, estimates of the economic value created by changing to the new regulatory regime, or the free trade, for example. That free trade alone probably pays for all the economic research that's ever been done. And you have just one issue there. So the idea was I wanted to promote the idea that economic research is actually making some positive contributions. If somebody else would like to write a book about the worst economic decisions, go do it. I wouldn't argue that you can't find them. But why does, every time I present this, why does somebody ask that question?
Okay, do we have one final question? Go on.
I mean, being myself an economist, obviously I agree with you that we contribute to the world, but as you said in the beginning, society typically is not convinced about this. So what can we do besides distributing your book that society starts believing us?
Yes, yes. If President Trump would be someone who actually reads, I might send him a copy of the international chapter. But the fact there is some evidence he doesn't read anything, not even the comic books. I don't know, and I keep thinking with what's happened with our tax cut at the wrong time, raising tariffs, that we're doing a pretty awful job in introductory economics. Because we do get a lot of congressional representatives in our courses. I mean, if you looked at Congress and found out, you know, what fraction of them were undergraduate economics majors, it would be disproportionately high. I don't know. We're just not doing a hot job.
So, I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking John for speaking.